Okay, in this video, I am going to cover section 9.3, the process of photosynthesis. And this is a really big section in our book. It's got so much information, so many tiny little details that we're going to spend quite a few days on this section. And it's about the process of photosynthesis. It's not as simple as taking water, CO2, a little bit of sunlight, and making sugars and oxygen. And so we are going to break it up into three parts. Today's part is going to focus on light-dependent reactions, what happens there. And then in a different lecture, it will talk about what happens during light-independent reactions. And then we will talk about factors that affect how fast photosynthesis occurs. So light-dependent reactions, its main job, what really happens here is that we are going to generate ATP and NADPH. And we're going to use that energy from ATP, that energy currency, and our electron carrier that we learned about in 9.2, NADPH. We are going to use the energy from these two molecules, and we are going to make sugars with them eventually. So here is a simplified diagram of light-dependent reactions versus light-independent reactions. And so we are going to focus on this left side of the diagram, where light comes in, water gets into the chloroplast, and we're going to focus in on the thylakoid, specifically the thylakoid membrane. And as a result, we are going to produce oxygen, and then our electron carrier, NADPH, and ATP. So use energy from sunlight to convert ADP and NADP+ into energy, ATP, and electron carriers, NADPH. Produce an oxygen as our byproduct. So let's take a look at exactly how this happens. Do you remember where light-dependent reactions occur in the chloroplast? In our assignment from 9.2, the overview of photosynthesis, I was looking for thylakoid, I believe. So light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid. So this is my chloroplast, and inside we have these coin-shaped or pancake-shaped flattened discs stacked on top of each other. And each one of these is a thylakoid. And when you get a stack of them, it's called a granum. And then outside the thylakoid in this fluid here is called the stroma. So we're going to spend a lot of time in the thylakoid membrane, and then when we get to light-independent reactions, we'll spend a lot of time in the stroma. So light-dependent reactions starts with light. So we're going to have to go back to talk a little bit about pigments. Okay, in section 9.2 overview, we talked about pigments. Pigments absorb sunlight, right? They absorb colors of the spectrum. There's different types of pigments. We talked about chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B and carotene. And so what happens, where do we find these pigments? We find them in locations called photosystems. So if we take a look at this diagram here, this is the thylakoid membrane. So we're inside the chloroplast. We have our thylakoid membrane. This is inside the thylakoid. It says interior of the thylakoid. This is outside the thylakoid. This is the stroma. So we're still in the chloroplast. And located within the thylakoid membrane, we have our pigments clustered together, and those clusters are called photosystems. So what's going to happen is that light's going to come in, and it's going to bounce around with the pigments, and it's going to get sent to a central location, kind of like a satellite dish, how the light kind of bounces around, and it gets focused onto the center, and then it's going to be directed elsewhere. So the energy from photons is going to bounce around between these pigments, and then down here we have a special pair of chlorophyll molecules that really get that energy and transfer it to electrons. And then I'll talk about where those electrons come from and where do they go. But photosystems are basically clusters of chlorophyll and proteins that help absorb sunlight. So there are 4 main stages of the light-dependent reactions, and I think I have this in your notes, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to label it. But the first step I'm going to talk about is called photosystem 2. Okay, so we're going to start off discussing what happens in photosystem 2. And if you just take a look at this diagram here, you can see we have water. Oh geez, this kind of looks like where oxygen gets made. I see some electrons. I see light coming in. And then the second part is called the electron transport chain, which is a series of proteins found in the thylakoid membrane. So electron transport chain is a chain of proteins, and the electrons get transported through. The third stage of light-dependent reactions is our photosystem 1. Now you might be wondering, wait a minute, why don't they just call it photosystem 1 and then photosystem 2? Well, photosystem 1 was discovered first, and then they realized that there was more to the process that happens before it, and so they couldn't really quite change the name, so they called this photosystem 2 because it was discovered later. The fourth stage of light-dependent reactions is ATP formation, making that ATP, okay? And you can see we have our NADPH and ATP that get made, and they're going to go on to the light-independent reactions. There's my oxygen. Okay, so let's talk about photosystem 1 in depth. So here we see that we have water, and water becomes HNO. So it almost looks like we're taking apart water molecules. Notice I have 4 dots here and 2 reds, 4 dots, 2 reds. And it looks like some electrons somehow go here and then they leave. So let's take a look at what happens here. So in photosystem 2, water is going to split, and as a result, when we break water, we're going to produce oxygen as a byproduct, and that oxygen is going to leave the plant, and that's the oxygen we are breathing today. When water splits, it also generates some electrons, and those electrons get sent to photosystem 2, which I have abbreviated as PS2. While this is happening, chlorophyll, okay, is going to absorb light, and you can see I have my little round discs, okay, my pigments arranged. They're going to bounce around and they're going to hit the center of this reaction center, and those electrons from where water splits are going to get super energized, okay? So chlorophyll absorbs light and passes that energy from light onto the electrons, releasing them to a higher energy level. And then these high energy electrons are going to pass through from the chlorophyll to the ETC. So the second stage of light-dependent reactions is the ETC, or the electron transport chain. So now we're here. You can see it's a series of protein channels. So as these electrons are passing through, hydrogen is going to get pumped across. Okay, so if you take a look at this bigger picture here, I have lots of blue little dots inside here and few out here. And these hydrogen ions are moving across. How would I describe the concentration movement of these hydrogen ions? Is it high to low or low to high? It's actually low to high. We're moving from low to high, and what kind of transport is that? That's active transport. That's review from our previous chapter. So active transport means it requires energy. And where is that energy coming from? It's coming from those electrons, okay? So these electrons that are passing through the protein channels, they're given energy to these protein channels to pump hydrogen across. So hydrogen moves from the stroma to inside the thylakoid. And as a result, we're going to build up this high hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, so then those electrons, after they travel through the ETC, they're going to go to photosystem 1. And when it reaches photosystem 1, it's lost a little bit of energy from the ETC, and it's going to get re-energized. So these electrons get re-energized, bounce them to a higher energy state where they get picked up by our electron carrier, NADP+, to become NADPH. So I think I put this diagram in your notes, but this is what we've covered so far. Photosystem 2, electron transport chain, photosystem 1. Okay, light comes in, bounces around, water splits, generating oxygen. The electrons from water get energized. You can see the tiny little E- sign. They get energized. They travel through the ETC. As they travel through the ETC, hydrogen gets pumped across. That's not in this diagram. That's the only thing wrong with this diagram. To photosystem 1, where they get re-energized by light again. And as you can see, a higher energy state, and they're going to get picked up by our electron carrier. So over here we have this water split in photosystem. That's photosystem 2. So photons kind of hit this seesaw lever. Electrons get energized to a higher state. They go through this ATP mill, losing a little bit of energy. They're going to get re-energized. And this is our NADPH producing photosystem. And then, boom, there's our electron carrier picking it up. The fourth and final stage of light-dependent reactions is ATP formation. And so when electrons are passing through the ETC, I told you that these hydrogen ions are getting built up. Okay, look at this high concentration compared to out here where it's low. So we have this high hydrogen concentration. There's a reason for it. these hydrogen ions are going to flow through another protein channel called ATP synthase. Now, the cool thing about ATP synthase is that it actually looks like a water turbine. Excuse me. Hey, Amber. Sure. Can I go right after school, 3:30? Cool. Because it makes me nervous to go during my prep, just because you never know how long it will take. Okay, no problem. Okay, bye. I'm so sorry. Okay, so the cool thing about ATP synthase is that it actually looks like a water turbine. Okay, it's got these like rotors down here, and hydrogen flows through it and it spins it. And as it spins, it takes ADP plus P, so adenosine diphosphate, plus P, and turns it into adenosine triphosphate, ATP. How cool is that? As those hydrogen ions flow through, they also get picked up by an electron carrier, NADP+. And now we have really made NADPH, and that's what that H comes into play, because it's got hydrogen with those electrons that are picked up after photosystem 1. And then ATP and ADP, ATP plus NADPH will move on to the light-independent reactions. So here's a picture of the ATP synthase, and it spins, and hydrogen flows on through, and it literally takes ADP plus P and turns it into ATP. Okay, so I know I threw a lot at you. It wouldn't be a bad idea to read about light-dependent reactions in the book and then stop when you get to light-independent reactions. There's also a one-sided worksheet that I'm going to post. So I'm sorry I got this out later than I wanted to.